All right, everybody, we're back for part 2 of Where's America Going by Mr. Caleb Maupin. I'm going to take like 1 minute to do a few checkbox things to make sure I don't record this for 2 hours and lose all my audio as I have before. So we're going to make sure we have the right mic selected. Yes, we do. I am in the video. Okay. I'm going to make sure my stream is coming through and I'm getting it out of both speakers here. If you don't want to listen to this, you can look in the comments. I'll have a timestamp of where the book starts. And I forgot to link to part 1, but it's on my channel under live. I'll put the link in there too when I'm done. All right, let's look up me. See if I'm live. I am. Let's make sure we're getting audio. Yep. Hear it out of both ears. I'm good. All right. So I think we're good to go. Let's get started. Share screen. All right. Share window. Share. Where is America going? There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. That's where we're starting tonight. I'm going to make that big. Get me out of it. And now we're going to start GarageBand. So we get a high quality version. Once again, if this is like skipping or, doesn't sound great, subscribe and check back later. I will edit a full 4K, wave file audio. I'm recording that while I'm reading this. So for the cutting edge people, you can get it on the live stream. For everybody else, you can check that out later. All right, so here we go. Make sure we're recording here. Get some drinks for my parched throat ready. Open it. Be brave. All right, here we go. So we are starting 2:35. Hit record. There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. The Nazi Party emerged in the mid-1920s as the main current among right-wing anti-communist street fighters. Many different Freikorps factions merged into the Nazi Party, accepting its discipline and joining its very effective and brutal anti-communist street violence. Ernest Röhm, an open homosexual, was the chief of the Stormtroopers, the Nazi Party's group of armed strikebreakers who killed communists in the streets. The Nazi ideology drew heavily from the traditionalist German right wing of Oswald Spengler and Ernst Juncker, glorifying the notion of a German empire. The Nazis strayed from the main line of thinking among the German far right by embracing populism, calling for a people's revolution. They presented Marxism as a Jewish conspiracy and argued that Germany had only lost the First World War due to a stab in the back by the Marxists and labor unions who undermined the war effort. I'm going to check something real quick. This, my GarageBand file is like way louder than it was before. So something is up. I don't know if the recording level was changed. Let's put that on. Let's try to Control Z it. I'm going to open it from where it was before. It's all part of the fun here. Okay. See if we can get a more normal volume on that. So once again, I hate to do all this and then have to redo it. So, all right, it still looks really hot. That's where it was when I saved it. Okay. So that is... The levels look fine. All right. Let's try recording it from the top and see how it goes. 1, 2, 3. There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. Okay, that is still completely, totally huge waveforms. And I don't know exactly why. Let's try to restart it completely. Don't save. All right. So, let's try it again. We're having a rough start tonight. That's okay. We're not going to give up. I got GarageBand right, so we're good there. Can somebody say something in the comments if you can hear me? Can anybody hear me? Let me know. So I don't want to read and no one hear me for hours. So let's try to get it fixed up at the beginning. I'll check the stream again. Let's do that. I'll check the stream again. I'm here. Let's do that. Okay, so starting at the top. Let's go back to where we were. Hopefully this will be the last time. All right, right there. Okay. All right. We're going to hit record. Now my record button has disappeared. Oh man, this is fun. There it is. All right, that should work. Okay. So, that's good. Levels look good. Everything's okay. Let's hit record and go. There is no fascist ideology or aesthetic. The Nazi Party emerged in the mid-1920s as the main current among right-wing anti-communist street fighters. Many different Freikorps factions merged into the Nazi Party, accepting its discipline and joining its very effective and brutal anti-communist street violence. Ernst Röhm, an open homosexual, was the chief of the Stormtroopers, the Nazi Party's group of armed strikebreakers who killed communists in the streets. The Nazi ideology drew heavily from the traditionalist German right wing of Oswald Spengler and Ernst Juncker, glorifying the notion of a German empire. The Nazis strayed from the main line of thinking among the German far right by embracing populism, calling for a people's revolution. They presented Marxism as Jewish conspiracy and argued that Germany had only lost the First World War due to a stab in the back by the Marxists and labor unions who undermined the war effort. Nazi ideology in the early 1920s seemed to condemn capitalism and argued that communism was simply a foreign conspiracy invented by Jewish bankers and serving the foreign enemies in the Soviet Union, and that true socialism was nationalistic and loyal to the German state. However, in the late 1920s, as the Nazis were being actively groomed for power, the anti-capitalism of their rhetoric toned itself down. Hitler's polemics with Gregor Strasser argued that National Socialism simply meant that corporations would not be permitted to go against the national interests of the country. The Nazi Party dropped its calls for nationalization of industries. Arpam Dutt points out that the many analysts who focus on attempting to define a fascist ideology are completely missing the mark, and that fascism is not a set of ideas or beliefs, but rather a practice. Dutt writes, fascism, in fact, developed as a movement in practice, in the conditions of threatening proletarian revolution, as a counter-revolutionary mass movement supported by the bourgeoisie, employing weapons of mixed social demagogy and terrorism to defeat the revolution and build up a strengthened capitalist state dictatorship, and only later endeavored to adorn and rationalize this process with a theory. It is in this actual historical process that the reality of fascism must be found, and not in the secondary derivative attempts post festum at adornment with a theory. No less unsatisfactory are the attempted anti-fascist interpretations of fascism in terms of ideology or abstract political conceptions. The conventional anti-fascist ideological interpretations of fascism see in fascism only the principle of dictatorship or violence. Dictatorships from the right have existed and can exist in hundreds of forms without any sense constituting fascism. Tsarism was a dictatorship from the right, but Tsarism was not fascism. The White Guard dictatorships immediately after the war for crushing the revolution were dictatorships from the right. But these White Guard dictatorships were not yet fascism, and only subsequently began to develop fascist characteristics as they began to try to organize a more permanent basis. Subsequent evolution in Hungary and Finland. Fascism may be in fact a reactionary dictatorship, but not every reactionary dictatorship is fascism. The specific character of fascism has still to be defined. Wherein then lies the specific character of fascism? The specific character of fascism cannot be defined in terms of abstract ideology or political first principles. The specific character of fascism can only be defined by laying bare its class basis, the system of class relations within which it develops and functions, and the class role which it performs. Only so can fascism be seen in its concrete reality, corresponding to a given historical stage of capitalist development and decay. Put simply, there is no fascist ideology and no fascist aesthetic. Fascism is whatever demagogy and propaganda mishmash is needed to justify the heavy-handed repression and violence used to stabilize a country amid economic crisis and the threat of socialist revolution. The German financier Hjalmar Schacht first met with Hitler on January 5, 1931. Weitz's biography of Schacht describes the meeting this way. Hitler arrived dressed in a Nazi Party uniform. He seemed quite unaffected and modest. Schacht discovered what many others were to learn. A conversation with Hitler meant Hitler did most of the talking. Though Schacht reported little of the actual conversation, he soon introduced Hitler to Dr. Walther Funk, a financial journalist, who taught him some basic principles of economics. Schacht spent the following weeks lobbying Chancellor Brüning and other politicians, bringing them to consider including the Nazis in a future government. Weitz's biography goes on to explain that after the financial downturn in September of 1931, support for Hitler became more widespread among German industrialists. As an act of ambition and a grab for power, Alfred Hugenberg, the right-wing industrialist, instigated a rally of the so-called national opposition. It included Hugenberg's steel helmet, German National Party, and the Agrarian Party of the aristocratic monarchist landowners, as well as the National Socialist Nazi Party. He arranged a mass event in the beautiful little mountain spa, Bad Harzburg, in the Harz Mountains. It became known as the Harzburger Front. Many prominent individuals, all opponents of the democratic Weimar regime, also attended. Among them were dozens of industrialists, including Fritz Thyssen, many titled landowners, 4 royal princes, 2 of them sons of the former Kaiser, and a gaggle of dukes, counts, and barons. There were 16 former generals. The ascendancy of Adolf Hitler to the position of German Chancellor was primarily due to the alliance he formed with the financier Hjalmar Schacht. In the 1932 elections, the Nazi Party received 33% of the vote. The Social Democrats received 20%, and the Communists received 16%. The German Center Party, a right-wing group, received 11%. Because no party had received a clear majority, a coalition government needed to be formed among different parties. Weitz's biography describes other sections of the German ruling class who threw their lot behind Hitler in the aftermath of the vote. Kepler, who owned a small chemical business, was a longtime advisor to Adolf Hitler and was his contact with heavy industry. Kepler then approached Schacht and asked him to help with men like Vogler of the steel industry and Karl Helfferich, Schacht's old opponent but now a new ally. Kepler's fundraising activities were organized into the so-called Kepler Kreis, Kepler Circle, and Schacht was not reluctant to become a member of it. He sensed the swing of the political pendulum and wanted to be involved. Many leading industrialists were still quite reluctant. Friedrich Flick, the coal and iron magnate, donated a token 50,000 marks to the Nazis and gave 1.8 million marks to help re-elect von Hindenburg. Von Papen met with Steel King Gustav Krupp in Dusseldorf on January 7, 1933, but met resistance. The heads of the IG Farben, Bosch, and Siemens were equally tepid about Hitler. Franz von Papen, the head of the German Center Party, negotiated with Nazis to form a coalition government, and on January 30th, 1933, Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany. In his speech accepting the new position as head of state, Hitler asked the country, "Give me 4 years," and they would not recognize the country. Then, on February 27th, the German parliament building, Reichstag, was burned by an arsonist. The Communist Party was declared responsible for the arson and outlawed. The seats the Communist Party held in the parliament were handed over to the Nazi Party, which then had a majority of seats and proceeded to ratify a new constitution and established a new authoritarian government. Right-wing psychologist Jordan Peterson has told audiences that, we should never forget that Hitler was elected, When he was elected, by a large majority too, it was a landslide vote. The kind of vote that no modern democratic leader ever gets. So, although it's difficult for people to swallow, it's hard not to assign culpability for what happened in Germany to the society at every strata. Peterson uses this to claim human beings have a sinister nature deep down and that populism is dangerous. However, Peterson's claim is simply historical revisionism. The Nazis never received a majority vote in the elections. The Nazis only took power through an alliance with other forces, and heavy-handed political repression following what was most likely a planned false flag operation. The Nazis were selected by the German elite and imposed on the country to prevent a revolution. They did not take power as the result of unbridled populism, as Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, Leo Strauss, and many of the prevailing synthetic left voices proclaim in their elitist screeds. The Nazis in power. The Nazis made the stormtroopers an official government police agency, legalizing their acts of violence against communists, Jews, and other groups. On May 17, 1933, labor unions, strikes, and lockouts were outlawed. The German Labor Front, a Nazi Party organization, was the only legal labor union, and the leaders of other labor unions were arrested. The first few months the Nazis were in power were marked by an upsurge of street chaos, with newly legalized violence and terror being an aspect of daily life. After a year in office, Hitler then launched his infamous Night of the Long Knives and executed the leaders of the Stormtrooper organization in order to stabilize the country and end the street fighting chaos. The new government took a number of very swift, dramatic economic moves to stabilize the economy. First, thousands of leaders of the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party were placed in a newly constructed network of prison labor camps. Lots of money was spent building the camps, lots of people were employed as guards, and the prisoners functioned as free labor for corporations, functioning as a corporate subsidy. In essence, the Nazi government created the first prison industrial complex, using government spending on mass incarceration and forced labor to stimulate economic growth. Women were urged to leave the workforce, with the Nazi Party launching a public relations campaign shaming unmarried women who worked outside of their homes and paying a massive cash bonus to couples who got married. The government began hiring millions of Germans to begin the construction of the Autobahns, new highways stretching across the country. The mass imprisonment, the construction of a new system of prison camps, the push of women out of the labor force, and the construction of the Autobahns all resulted in a significant decrease in unemployment. Schacht also arranged for Germany to begin the process of rebuilding its military. According to Weitz, in 1933, Schacht believed in the rearmament of Germany, and so did Adolf Hitler. Schacht always insisted their reasons differed radically, but in 1933, their thrust was parallel. To prime the manufacture of armaments and to slice away at unemployment, he founded a small shell corporation strangely named the Metallurgical Research Company, or MEFO. The purpose of MEFO was to finance large government contracts for armaments. So it was estimated there were 21 billion marks in orders. Payments were guaranteed by the Reichsbank. Some of the money came from what had been re-questioned by the so-called conversion fund. It was ironic that a portion of German rearmament was paid for with foreign money. During the next 4 years, the value of MEFO bonds grew from the original 1 million marks to 12 billion marks. The MEFO bonds became a very desirable investment, with their rising value and guaranteed 4% interest. To further stimulate the economy, the Nazis had not only created a prison industrial complex, but also a military industrial complex. Militaristic activities and training became part of the public educational system once again, as they had been before the war. Jean Mochat became Hitler's finance minister, and he announced that Germany would not be paying any further reparations to the Allied powers and would be defaulting and not making any further payments on loans it had received from Britain and the United States. All of these moves resulted in an economic boom. The Nazi government eradicated unemployment, ended inflation, and oversaw a very significant rise in living standards. The main beneficiaries were German industrial capitalist dynasties like the Krupps and Thysens. They had been crushed by the British and American banks at the end of the First World War, but they also hated communism as it supported labor unions, which cut into their profits and threatened to seize their property in a revolution. The Nazis were able to reboot the German economy primarily with military spending and the creation of a slave labor underclass. Like all Bonapartism, Hitler's measures were only temporarily successful. By 1939, the German economy was crashing again. The Nazi government responded by launching the horrendous events we now know as the Second World War and the Holocaust. As Lynn Marcus explains, Nazi military operations represented the means of securing the loot on which German capitalism depended. The Nazi military machine and its operations represented the armed forces which sustained the German capital as capital. Germany's military undertakings were launched over the strong objections of the High Command, which was systematically purged to overcome such objections. The Second World War was imposed upon German militarism by the hysterical demands for immediate loot of the smokestack barons and financiers. Bonapartism Case Study. Roosevelt's America. After the 1929 stock market crash in America, it became clear that the economic downturn was long-term. Mass layoffs, bank failures, home foreclosures, and evictions swept the country. Homeless encampments called Hoovervilles sprung up across the country. Farmers went under, and families fled to California to find work. The Communist Party went from obscurity to positioning itself as the champion of the unemployed. The Communist International called March 6, 1931, International Unemployment Day, and just as in Europe, the major cities of the United States were swept with huge protests demanding work or wages now. In the summer of 1932, 43,000 unemployed veterans occupied the National Mall in Washington, D.C., demanding a payment of benefits before they were cleared out by the military. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had existed as a run-of-the-mill Democrat from a prominent political family in New York. He had long maintained an alliance with the Rockefeller family, the descendants of John D. Rockefeller, the creator of Standard Oil. Vince Copeland writes, his early financial backers, before the convention, included the politically generous Herbert Lehman of Lehman Brothers and the Corn Exchange Bank, now Chemical Bank, Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the Kennedy brothers, the Henry Morgenthaus, Sr. and Jr., Joseph E. Davies, husband of the heir of post-serial millions, and Jesse Strauss, then president of Macy's huge department store. In the actual campaign, the staunch Al Smith supported John J. Raskob of the DuPonts and gave FDR $23,000. Another great Smith supporter, Bernard Baruch, the millionaire Morgan Messenger, gave $60,000. The Rockefellers were displeased with Hoover, but still contributed to his campaign to keep their well-known inside track with the Republican Party. However, several Standard Oil families, like the Whitneys and the Harkises, gave heavily to the Democrats. When Roosevelt took office after winning the 1932 presidential election, it was clear he had some aspirations to be a strong man who could bring the country back into order. His inauguration speech spoke of driving the money changers out of the temple, and he pushed forward the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial and speculative banking. Roosevelt's initial moves as president were somewhat modest. The National Industrial Recovery Act was intended to regiment industry and more closely manage it. The U.S. Department of Agriculture engaged in various schemes to inflate food prices, including one that was vividly remembered by Nelson Peary, who was a boy living on a farm in Minnesota. Conditions worsened in 1933 and 1934. One day, men from the government came to town and purchased almost half the cattle in the area. They herded the cattle into a ditch and shot them. The government agents poured lime over the carcasses and then covered them with dirt so people wouldn't eat them. When people cursed them, the government people said it was necessary to do this in order to come out of the Depression. People starved because there were too many cattle. In 1933, U.S. Marine Corps General Smedley Butler revealed that among the rich and powerful, many felt Roosevelt's methods were too mild and were looking to Hitler and Mussolini for inspiration. Eventually, the McCormack-Dickstein Committee brought Butler in to testify what the coup plotters had discussed with him. Butler said that Connecticut businessman Gerald McGuire had approached him, saying that plans for a fascist coup against Roosevelt would have support from those connected to J.P. Morgan, Bethlehem Steel, Goodyear Tires, and other major corporations. Butler says he responded to the offer for him to lead 500,000 soldiers to seize Washington, D.C. and establish a military regime by saying, if you get 500,000 soldiers advocating anything smelling of fascism, I am going to get 500,000 more and lick the hell out of you, and we will have a real war right at home. The summer of 1934 marked a turning point in Roosevelt's presidency and the history of the United States. In 1934, 3 major U.S. cities were shut down by communist-led municipal general strikes. The Minneapolis Teamsters strike, the San Francisco Dock Workers strike, and the Auto Light strike of Toledo, Ohio, represented a significant level of escalation in working-class unrest. The National Guard was sent in to battle armed labor unionists in all 3 cities. Gunfire was exchanged. In Minneapolis, the strike committee functioned as a kind of dual government, with patrols across the city enforcing the rule, no scab trucks, and bashing in the windows of any vehicle not permitted by the union. In 1934, a wave of strikes led by communists escalated the class struggle. Facing the danger of a fascist coup, Roosevelt was forced to strategically align with organized labor and the Soviet Union. Textile workers and sharecroppers across the South were also on the move in communist-led unions. A state of emergency was declared in South Carolina as impoverished workers, white and black, fought against their employers. Talk of the need for a fascist coup to stop the communists and labor militants increased among the rich and powerful. Roosevelt could see that he was in serious danger of being overthrown, and in 1935, the economic policies of his administration significantly shifted. With an executive order, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration and hired millions of unemployed workers. He deployed them to build highways, bridges, parks, and post offices. The Civilian Conservation Corps lived in tents and wore bright green government-issued uniforms. The same year, Roosevelt also passed the Wagner Act, cementing into law that workers have the right to strike and unionize, and creating the National Labor Relations Board that negotiated industrial disagreements and certified union elections. Hiring millions of unemployed workers and legalizing and empowering the reformist labor leaders of the American Federation of Labor had the effect of calming the country down. However, among the rich and powerful, it was decried as a communist conspiracy. Al Smith, leader of the New York City Democratic Party, formed the American Liberty League and denounced Roosevelt as a communist. Vince Copeland explains, Roosevelt, by intervening on behalf of millions in the way he did, kept the system from falling. It has been more or less correctly said he opposed capitalists in order to save capitalism. But in order to carry on such a hazardous operation as opposing capitalists While serving as the chief political presiding officer of the U.S. capitalist system, Roosevelt had to gain himself a considerable social base in the enemy class, that is, the working class, which includes the unemployed, and he had to be able to utilize this class against the capitalists whose system he served. In the 1936 election, Roosevelt shifted significantly to the left. He spoke in Madison Square Garden about how he welcomed the hatred of Wall Street, saying, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master." To be clear, Roosevelt represented one wing of the ruling class that was facing all-out opposition from the rest of the rich and powerful. Roosevelt's allies included the Rockefellers, as well as a few others among the ultra-rich. In 1937, FDR Jr. married Ethel DuPont, indicating that at least one of America's top families was still on good terms with him. A few among the oil banking elite favored stability and the need to prevent all-out chaos in the streets, and were willing to see the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Ford, and the Morgans accept losses in the form of union contracts and an increased welfare state. In 1936, Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, explained why his party was essentially backing Roosevelt while running their own symbolic campaign. All the most reactionary groups in the country are gathering in one camp in order to bring fascism to the United States. Primarily through the Hearst press, they have carried on a campaign against everything that is liberal or progressive in the country. They are determined to defeat Roosevelt in 1936 and place an administration in power that will carry out a program of reaction to the full satisfaction of the Morgans, the DuPonts, and the few ruling families of the United States. Roosevelt, of course, seeks to achieve the same class objectives as his opponents from the right. In fact, he meets most of their attacks by taking a step further to the right himself. But although their goals are the same, Roosevelt pursues a different path and necessarily bases himself on different groups within the bourgeoisie. He tries to retain the support of the workers, the farmers, and the middle class groups by posing as a liberal. He is the spokesman for those industrial and financial groups that are in conflict with the House of Morgan. To placate the masses, Roosevelt has made tangible concessions to the well-to-do farmers and miserly ones to the workers. To rely upon Roosevelt to keep fascism from coming to power plays into the hands of the Liberty League. When providing analysis of Roosevelt's sweeping victory in 1936, Copeland writes, "Never had an election been so badly lost with so much Wall Street money riding on the loser." Copeland goes on to explain how the bulk of the ruling class was opposed to Roosevelt. The editorials and even front pages of most newspapers thundered against FDR, with at least 80% of the daily press being fiercely opposed to him, and the other 20% only tepidly for him. Copeland explains that in the 1936 election, the Democrats received considerable money from the very rich too, but nothing like the golden outpouring that filled the Republican coffers to overflowing. The Wall Street money the Democrats got was not decisive. On the whole, it was the same consolation money that Wall Street usually gives the party scheduled for defeat. in order that big business can still use that party on another day. Roosevelt's victory in November of 1936 was astounding. Millions of people who had been indifferent and not voted in 1932 or 1928 poured into the polls to vote for the man who had hired them to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps, or enabled them to see an increase in their wages with a union contract as a result of the Wagner Act. Roosevelt was enacting real economic reforms and improving people's lives in a moment when malnutrition-related deaths were taking place, and dead bodies of hungry and unemployed workers were regularly found on the street. A mill hand in North Carolina told a reporter in a widely quoted comment that he voted for Roosevelt because Roosevelt is the only man we ever had in the White House who would understand that my boss is a son of a bitch. Roosevelt had referenced the fact that industrial capitalists were threatening mass layoffs if he won the election. In his Madison Square Garden speech, Roosevelt explained, "The very employers and politicians and publishers who talked most loudly of class antagonism and the destruction of the American system now undermine that system by this attempt to coerce the votes of the wage earners of this country. It is the 1936 version of the old threat to close down the factory or the office if a particular candidate does not win. It is an old strategy of tyrants to delude their victims into fighting their battles for them." In response to Roosevelt's sweeping victory at the polls, the capitalists made good on their threats and mass layoffs ensued in industry. Starting in December of 1936, workers facing layoffs began occupying their factories and refusing to leave. The Flint set-down strike of 1937, in which auto workers seized their factory, turned into a national mobilization as thousands of labor unionists poured into the Michigan city to support the workers against the police and the local fascist organizations such as the Black Legion. Roosevelt sent the military to Flint, and the crowd was shocked when the machine guns were pointed away from the factory. Roosevelt had sent the military to protect striking workers. Roosevelt's administration then proclaimed that set-down strikes were legal. The Congress of Industrial Organizations split from the AFL as a new, much more radical labor federation that openly employed communists as organizers. Set-down strikes swept the country. In 1937, Roosevelt created Social Security and unemployment insurance. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, spoke at the convention of the American Youth Congress, a communist-led student activist group. Later, organizers from the Young Communist League were invited to sleep over at the White House when facing subpoenas before a congressional committee. In the 1940 election, Roosevelt selected Henry Wallace as his vice president. Wallace had created the food stamps program when he led the U.S. Department of Agriculture, seeing it as a subsidy for American farmers. Wallace openly praised the Soviet Union as an anti-fascist ally and spoke of creating a century for the common man rather than the American century after defeating the Nazis. The Democratic Party forced Roosevelt to drop Wallace from the ticket in 1944 and replace him with Harry Truman. In his final State of the Union address during the Second World War, Roosevelt proposed an economic Bill of Rights to be added to the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing jobs, health care, and education to all Americans. Roosevelt died shortly before the Second World War came to its conclusion, and he remains one of the most popular presidents in U.S. history. Roosevelt is absolutely an example of bonapartism, and the more threatened by his own class he became, the more he moved into strategic alliance with communists, labor unions, the Soviet Union, and other progressive forces. Roosevelt's worldview. British economist John Maynard Keynes is largely considered to be the economic inspiration for the Roosevelt administration. Keynes was the prominent voice in academic economics who emerged during the 1930s to criticize neoclassical and free market economics. Keynes denounced Marxism, but argued that in order to preserve capitalism, it was necessary for the government to spend money in order to prevent underconsumption. The most commonly used cliche to explain Keynes's economic theories is the analogy of ditch diggers. The concept is that the government should employ a group of men to dig a ditch. Then the government should employ another group of men to fill it in. Some would see this as a waste, but with the government wages these men were paid, they buy food, pay their rent, and get the private sector of the economy moving again. While neoclassical and more recently liberal economists would argue that the market naturally resolves its problems, Keynesians argue that government spending to stimulate economic activity is a necessity. Following the Second World War, economists were met with what is referred to as the Keynesian consensus. There was an almost universal understanding that in order to prevent events like the 1930s Depression, with its dramatic consequences resulting in the Second World War, free market policies had to be abandoned, and the government needed to manage the economy. The rise of neoliberal economics during the 1970s, escalating especially following the fall of the Soviet Union, saw a repudiation of the Keynesian consensus among the circles of power. The Mont Pelerin Society of Ludwig von Mises, the popularization of Milton Friedman, and the rise of Alan Greenspan showed that among those who held government power, there was far less interest in Keynesianism than in those who promoted notions of a more unbridled capitalism. Keynesian theories have remained dominant among academic economists, with many seeing the Chicago School, the Austrian School, and other libertarian theories to be nothing but well-funded quackery. Regardless, the economic policies of Nazi Germany and Rooseveltian America were both more or less Keynesian. The government spent large amounts of money to stimulate economic growth amid an overall depression. However, there was a fundamental difference. Roosevelt's administration spent money primarily on infrastructure. Roosevelt launched the Tennessee Valley Authority to bring electricity to rural areas and increase agricultural output. Roosevelt connected remote regions of the country to urban centers and the coasts with new roads and bridges. Roosevelt also improved postal access and constructed new airports. The infrastructure Roosevelt created enabled the post-war boom in the USA to happen much more rapidly. If the power plants, roads, bridges, and airports had not been constructed during the late 1930s, it would have taken much longer for U.S. industries to explode in the 1950s as they did. In addition to the infrastructure, Roosevelt's spending seemed to focus on making the population smarter. The post offices built by the WPA often contained social realist murals. Music and arts education was promoted in the schools. Vannevar Bush was hired by the Roosevelt administration to oversee government funding for scientific research and direction of technological development. Despite Jim Crow segregation existing and being politically impossible to oppose within Roosevelt's Democratic Party, there seemed to be a subtle interest in lifting up African Americans, Jews, and other groups that faced discrimination. Henry Morgenthau, a man of Jewish heritage, functioned as Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury and can be credited with crafting a lot of the administration's economic policies. Eleanor Roosevelt made a point of highlighting African American musicians, and Roosevelt openly met with Black labor leader A. Philip Randolph at the White House. Roosevelt, it should be noted, was very hostile to Zionism, despite being overwhelmingly popular among American Jews. While Roosevelt was very enthusiastic about establishing U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia, he was noted for being frequently rude and uninterested in meeting with those who favored creating Israel. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. goes out of its way to demonize Roosevelt and present him as anti-Semitic and complicit in the Holocaust despite his excessive record of anti-fascism and support from American Jews. Roosevelt's economic reforms were certainly the most dramatic that any American president has ever enacted. He hired millions of unemployed people, built a massive amount of infrastructure, created scores of government programs such as unemployment insurance and Social Security, and created many financial regulations and forms of government economic oversight. Roosevelt's economic reforms, as confusedly negotiated as they were, fit more or less into a tradition of political economy that has been labeled the American school. Alexander Hamilton pushed for a national bank in the immediate aftermath of the founding in the United States and spent money on constructing lighthouses as a form of infrastructure that would facilitate the inflow of international trade. Henry Charles Carey, who Karl Marx labeled the only American economist of any merit, composed an anti-slavery manifesto arguing that the Southern plantation system was part of a British financier's vision of keeping the world poor. Hamilton, Carey, and later German economists Friedrich List and his ally, the socialist philosopher Eugene Düring, rejected the notion of class struggle. They instead favored the state functioning to control the economy by balancing a harmony of interests to benefit the population of a specific nation-state. The belief that the state should be guided by some kind of religious or moral principles and regulating the economy in line with them seems to have been a factor in this thinking. This school of American economics, or Christian economy, is not to be confused with economic nationalism. While economic nationalism emphasizes tariffs and trade regulations, along with supporting key industries as national champions, the Rooseveltian economic policies were rather a kind of progressive statism. The focus is on a good government ensuring economic growth, making the population smarter, and building a more enlightened world. It is the kind of thinking that is associated largely with New England radicalism in the United States and the best traditions of the American Revolution. One can see the influence of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Henry George, whose theories about taxing land values inspired the founding of the British Liberal Democratic Party, can also be described as from this tradition. It made sense that Roosevelt's administration would move in such a direction while also being forced into an alliance with the Marxists in organized labor and the Soviet Union internationally. One can see such an influence on the Kennedy administration as well. The Roosevelt administration's policies were those of old-school American liberals who believed in growth and optimism, but were never radical enough to become Marxists. These folks were somewhat socially conservative and religious and did not share the attitudes of the eventually emerging New Left. When looking over Roosevelt's roots, the influence of Endicott Peabody, the Christian socialist schoolmaster who educated him and many of his closest allies in an elite boarding school for the New England elite, cannot be underestimated. Peabody was an Episcopal priest who ran the Groton School for Boys, an expensive private school located 5 miles north of Boston. The school was known for its harsh discipline and emphasis on hard work, giving privileged young men a harshness they might not receive elsewhere in life. The school centered around a philosophy of muscular Christianity that emphasized athletics and keeping young men busy and closely monitored to preserve their moral purity. In addition to the Spartan atmosphere, it was also known for instilling compassion and a sense of social responsibility. Roosevelt described Peabody saying, "As long as I live, his influence will mean more to me than that of any other people next to my father and mother." Elsewhere, he described him as the biggest influence in my life. Peabody officiated Roosevelt's wedding, the First Lady Eleanor. Peabody also held a special church service in Washington, D.C. for the president-elect and his family members on the morning of his first inauguration. Endicott Peabody, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's schoolmaster and lifelong friend, was a Christian socialist who instilled values of compassion and kindness in him as a young man. The difference between Rooseveltism and Nazism. There are significant fundamental differences between Roosevelt's Bonapartism and the Bonapartism of Adolf Hitler, though they were both enacted during the 1930s in a Western industrialized country. While Roosevelt's reforms were rolled out gradually in response to threats against them, the Nazis moved very quickly, enacting their major economic changes in their first 2 years of power. The Nazis, unlike Roosevelt, had an absolute monopoly on political power during these years, with all opposition being keys a variety of different social forces that made up his coalition. Other than the Autobahn highways, the Nazi state power did not really boost great infrastructure projects. Power plants were built, water systems were created, but this was all secondary. The Nazi state, unlike the Roosevelt administration, focused on stimulating the economy through degrowth. Describing how it was that the Nazi state revitalized the economy, American journalist Lothrop Stoddard observed, "How did the Nazis actually finance their ambitious projects without currency nor price inflation? They did it in a number of ways. Fluid capital was regimented and either invested according to orders or diverted into government loans. Profits were skimmed off by basic taxation. Above all, consumption was kept down and living standards were lowered by what was called a process of reverse inflation." The upshot had been that the German people have financed astounding expenditures by literally taking it out of their own hides. Creating a class of labor camp slaves, reducing consumption, and spending huge amounts on militarism all stimulated the German economy enough to see a dramatic recovery. Weitz's biography of Nazi economist Hjalmar Schacht confirms this. Schacht had a disdain for what he called ditch digging. It was one of the things he found to criticize in FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps and publicly administered work projects. Roosevelt hired millions of unemployed young men into the Civilian Conservation Corps, part of his Works Progress administration that constructed infrastructure as an economic stimulus. Rather than merely employing millions of people to build things, the Nazis' most dramatic method of curbing unemployment was mass imprisonment and driving women from the labor market. The German car industry benefited significantly from the labor of concentration camp inmates, as did armaments manufacturers. The Nazis eliminated the collective bargaining power of workers and restored the 12-hour workday. As Lyndon LaRouche, writing under the pseudonym Lynn Marcus, wrote in his 1975 book, Dialectical Economics, the two principal bases for the Nazi pseudo-recovery of 1933 to 1936 were fixing of wages at the lowest depression levels and the depletion of the previously idled constant capital of German industry. Not only were wages reduced, but the real content was further reduced by exacerbated inflation, while the intensification of exploitation of labor was accelerated. By 1936 to 1937, the success of Nazi full employment recovery was obviously moving to the point of crisis. In the means of production, the quality of German labor power was being depleted by intensification and lower standards of material culture. Simultaneously, the expansion of Nazi production had been based on massive issuance of fictitious values in promissory notes. The ability of the Reichsbank and other agencies to refinance this cancerously growing mass, to cover the growth of debt service obligation beyond the scale of available product for its payment was imminently undermined. The Reichsmark faced the prospect of early national bankruptcy. Of course, like all Bonapartist schemes to control capitalism with state power and regenerate the economy, the results were only temporarily successful. By 1939, the Nazi economy was facing a full-blown slowdown, and a war of expansion to conquer new markets became a necessity for Hitler's regime. Stoddard goes on to write, by 1938, evidence accumulated that the furious pace of Nazi Wirtschaft, really war economy, was running into the economic law of diminishing returns and was likewise entailing serious physical and psychological overstrain in every class of society. The Nazi state also had a particular fixation on eugenics. They believed the unrest of the previous century was rooted in a genetic defect in Jews, and that society's problems could be resolved by breeding them out. Nazis had a mystical admiration for what they termed the Aryan race, and the government began working hard to purify the population. Stoddard observed, nothing is so distinctive in Nazi Germany as its ideas about race. Its concept about racial matters underlies the whole National Socialist philosophy of life and profoundly influences its policies and practices. The Nazis began euthanizing the disabled people and publicly playing up the idea that impure stock was a burden on the country. Political dissidents and others deemed unfit were forcibly sterilized by a special network of courts. According to what Stoddard was told by the Nazis who ran the Eugenics High Court of Appeals, prior to the Nazi takeover, morons, criminals, and other antisocial elements were reproducing themselves at a rate 9 times as great as that of the general population. And those lowest elements were favored in their breeding by the welfare measures of the Weimar regime. And thus, when Nazis were in power, they coupled their encouragement to sound citizens with a drastic curb on the defective elements. The curb was the sterilization law. In essence, Nazism differed from Rooseveltism in that Nazism was about glorifying the past, purging society of elements deemed impure or undesirable, and rebooting the economy through destruction and reducing consumption. Nazi economics was about slave labor, mass spending on armaments, sterilization, political repression, and managing the population while glorifying war. While Roosevelt's economic reforms were carried out with the aim of increasing consumption and advancing technological and scientific progress. The Nazi regime ultimately resorted to slave labor on a major scale and forcible depopulation of territories it occupied during the Second World War. As LaRouche explains, during 1941 to 1945, particularly, the intensification of auto-cannibalism, primitive accumulation, proceeded along the following general lines. The working conditions of forced foreign guest labor were markedly worsened. The standard of living in the occupied territories generally lowered to prop up the Reichsmark. The depopulation of large sections of Slavic regions occupied by the Nazis, occupying administration, emulating the salvaging of used tire carcasses by a recapping firm as part of the slave labor system. Human bodies were squeezed of their accumulated wealth by slave labor conditions of production, and the depleted hulks returned to the SS for replacement parts. As a further measure of capitalist economics, the welfare rolls within the concentration camps were successfully reduced by the mass extermination practices applied to the weak, the aged, women, children, depleted slave labor, and other unemployables. Fascist economics in the 21st century. So let us be clear. Amid a time of economic crisis, the capitalists battle each other for control of the state. This process, whereby different factions among the elite battle to wrest control of the state apparatus and use it to stabilize the economy, is called bonapartism. Fascism is a particular form of bonapartism in which one faction of the ruling class seizes control of the state and seeks to reboot the economy, not with excessive state-directed stimulus and growth, but rather with controlled demolition and destruction of society and the population. With this understanding, we can proceed to our analysis of the present day and the question at hand: where is America going? In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, it appears that one faction that seeks to enact fascist economic policies on a global level has wrestled its hands onto the helm of power. It is persisting in its attempt to secure a total monopoly on power and enact fascist economic policies to stabilize capitalism. But it faces a wave of massive resistance and is constantly being forced to compromise and negotiate as its agenda unfolds. After the 2008 finance crisis, the Obama administration came into office. Barack Obama appointed eco-Malthusian fanatic John P. Holdren as the presidential science advisor. His 1977 textbook, Eco-Science, was co-authored by Paul Ehrlich, the author of The Population Bomb. In the book, Holdren wrote of the need for a planetary regime that could reduce the population with repressive measures that might include birthing licenses, mandatory abortions, or punishment for procreation. Holdren cited the rise of the population and living standards of Asia and Africa as a primary threat to the environment. He also spoke of a science court that would approve new technological inventions to make sure they are environmentally sound and won't use too many resources and damage the ecosystem. U.S. President Barack Obama appointed John P. Holdren as his science advisor. Holdren has consistently urged for dramatic measures to forcibly depopulate the third world. Tracy Stone Manning, the current director of the Bureau of Land Management for the Biden administration, is a former World Wildlife Federation employee whose master's thesis was on overpopulation. Her master's thesis included scripts for 8 public service announcements urging American families not to have more children, saying, "Americans believe overpopulation is only a problem somewhere else in the world, but it's a problem here too. When we overpopulate, the earth notices it more." Tracy Stone Manning currently serves as Biden's director of the Bureau of Land Management. Her academic master's thesis planned a public relations campaign to reduce the U.S. birth rate. From the Global 2000 report of the Carter administration to the Great Reset of the World Economic Forum, the belief is more or less the same. In order to prevent global unrest and bring stability, as well as to save the planet from climate change, a large faction of the elite believes it is necessary to implement a tightly controlled capitalism in order to reduce consumption and drive down the population. Nazi economics is back in fashion amid a long-term crisis of overproduction. The American elite views the ditch digging of China's Belt and Road Initiative or Russia's Eurasian Economic Union with the same contempt Schacht had for Roosevelt. In their view, the road to bring society back into order is depopulation and reducing living standards. Barack Obama made it clear when he visited South Africa and told the audience that if everyone on the continent could gain access to air conditioning, modern housing, and cars, it would be an ecological disaster and could not be allowed. On June 29, 2013, Obama told his audience of African students, "Ultimately, if you think about all the youth that everybody has mentioned here in Africa, if everybody's raising living standards to the point where everybody's got a car and everybody's got air conditioning and everybody's got a big house, well, the planet will boil over." The actions of the West in Africa match Obama's sentiments. While China and Russia have been building up the economies of African countries, the United States has facilitated instability with the flow of weapons and the backing of extremists. From the time Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975 up to 2002, the United States backed UNITA, a terrorist organization in its civil war against the Angolan government. The leader of UNITA, Jonas Savimbi, was a literal cannibal who waged his reign of terror with U.S. weapons. The flow of U.S. guns to drug gangs and anti-communist paramilitaries in South and Central America has played a similar role. George Soros and many of the wealthiest people in the Western capitalist world who position themselves as liberals, expressing concern about climate change and decrying racism and populism, have been among the biggest supporters of the International Criminal Court. This institution, that presents itself as an enforcer of international law, has never tried and convicted any individual who was not African. Almost all of the African people living in Libya prior to the 2011 regime change operations had cars, modern housing, and air conditioning. Since 2011, when the US and its allies funded rebels against the Islamic Socialist government and then backed them up with cruise missiles, the country has been cast into complete poverty and chaos, reducing the population to the poverty Obama deemed to be ecologically necessary. Now, much of the country has no electricity, and modern-day slave markets have been set up in Libya's ports. This is the result of the revolution against socialism, backed by Western capitalism in the name of freedom. The U.S. NATO military operations have significantly rolled back development in the Third World. Iraq was once a wealthy oil exporting country that had presided over a significant level of industrialization. The Gulf War, a decade of crippling sanctions, and then the U.S. invasion in 2003 reduced Iraq to poverty and chaos, driving it off the global oil markets and creating millions of refugees. The U.S. occupation of Afghanistan kept the country impoverished and in chaos for 20 years, but allowed the drug gangs, which the Taliban had suppressed, to set up shop once again. U.S. troops were even stationed at some points to guard their poppy fields. Russia and China are the primary targets of U.S. foreign policy because they are no longer poor. During the 20th century, both countries lifted themselves up and industrialized with socialist revolutions. Wall Street wants poor captive client states, not rival superpowers, competing on the global markets. Greta Thunberg, the teen idol of the climate change movement, made clear she opposes raising people out of poverty when she said to the United Nations, "Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" The message of her tear-filled, made-for-social media rants is that economic growth is inherently bad. Consumption and the population must be urgently reduced. This message is echoed by the Extinction Rebellion protesters with their hourglass logo. Thunberg's words are similar to those of Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. Sanger was originally a Marxist, but embraced Malthusianism, joining the British Neo-Malthusian Society and creating the Birth Control League with funding from the Rockefellers. As far as she was concerned, the problem in the global economy was not capitalism, but rather the human desire for growth and reproduction. Discontented workers may rally to Marxism because it places the blame for their misery outside of themselves and depicts their conditions as the result of a capitalistic conspiracy, thereby satisfying that innate tendency of every human being to shift the blame to some living person outside himself, and because it strengthens his belief that his sufferings and difficulties may be overcome by the immediate amelioration of his economic environment. In this manner, psychologists tell us, neuroses and inner compulsions are fostered. No true solution is possible, to continue this analogy, until the worker is awakened to the realization that the roots of his malady lie deep in his own nature, his own organism, his own habits. To blame everything upon the capitalist and the environment produced by capitalism is to focus attention upon merely one of the elements of the problem. The Marxian too often forgets that before there was a capitalist, there was exercised the unlimited reproductive activity of mankind, which produced the first overcrowding, the first want. This goaded humanity into its industrial frenzy, into warfare and theft and slavery. Capitalism has not created the lamentable state of affairs in which the world now finds itself. It has grown out of them, armed with the inevitable power to take advantage of our swarming, spawning millions. Sanger made clear that her belief in depopulation was tainted by racial bias. There were certain races and ethnic groups that needed to be depopulated much more than others, in her worldview. She wrote in 1920, birth control itself, often denounced as a violation of natural law, is nothing more or less than the facilitation of the process of weeding out the unfit, of preventing the birth of defectives, or of those who will become defectives. She wrote about efforts by the Birth Control League to cultivate African American ministers to promote contraception, writing, "We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members." Margaret Sanger, the founder of the Birth Control League, now called Planned Parenthood, abandoned Marxism after seeing that the Soviet Union was not a free love sex paradise. She became an outspoken Malthusian. Sanger popularized the concept of the cruelty charity, arguing that social welfare programs and charity were detrimental to society because they enabled low-income and non-white people to stay alive and reproduce rather than naturally perishing from poverty, rooted in their inferiority, and thus clear their inferior stock from the gene pool. Hillary Clinton has spoken of Margaret Sanger as one of her greatest idols. In 2009, Hillary Clinton said, "Now I have to tell you that it was a great privilege when I was told that I would receive this award. I admire Margaret Sanger enormously, her courage, her tenacity, her vision. And when I think about what she did all those years ago in Brooklyn, taking on archetypes, taking on attitudes and accusations flowing from all directions, I'm really in awe of her." The notion that the third world needs to be depopulated in order to save the global capitalist economy was an almost central belief of the British imperialists throughout the 1800s. This belief was used to justify the horrendous famines imposed throughout Africa, India, and in Ireland, in which millions starved to death due to free trade imposed at the point of bayonet. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, is quoted in 1988 as saying, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation." 2 years prior, he wrote the foreword to a book called People as Animals, written by Flore Cowles, published to raise money for the World Wildlife Fund. In his introduction, Prince Philip wrote, "I just wonder what it would be like to be reincarnated in an animal whose species had been so reduced in numbers that it was in danger of extinction. What would be its feelings toward the human species whose population explosion had denied it somewhere to exist? I must confess that I am tempted to ask for reincarnation as a particularly deadly virus, but that is perhaps going too far." Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, openly said he hoped to be reincarnated as a deadly virus in order to dramatically decrease the human population. Holding back development, preventing economic growth in the third world, reducing Africa, Asia, and Latin America to impoverished spheres of influence has long been the aim of imperialist strategists. The belief that it is urgently necessary to stop the developing world from industrializing and developing its own economy long predates the modern hysteria about global warming. Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, documents how neoliberal economic policies were imposed on Eastern Europe and South America throughout the 1990s with catastrophic humanitarian results. Malthusianism and degrowth is the very essence of imperialist economics. Books such as Walter Rodney's classic, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa go into great detail showing this. African economies are integrated into the very structure of the developed capitalist economies, and they are integrated in a manner that is unfavorable to Africa and ensures that Africa is dependent on the big capitalist countries. Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. One can recall how the British Empire burned down India's textile looms and forced a nation that had been weaving for thousands of years to import its cloth from Europe. A more recent example would be how Bill Clinton's NAFTA brought free trade to countries like Haiti and Mexico, nations where the population had grown its own food since long before the arrival of Christopher Columbus, had their agricultural sectors demolished and now rely on importing food from U.S. agribusiness. Bringing depopulation home. While keeping the third world poor has been the long-standing nature of imperialist economics, in the 21st century, amid a long-term economic crisis, the imperialists are bringing their degrowth policies back home. As technological leaps have created a crisis of overproduction and falling rates of profit, the desperation to get the economy moving again is rising among the rich and powerful. They now take aim at Middle America. Black Americans were the first targets of the degrowth operations. To punish Detroit for the leftist atmosphere and strength of black nationalism and labor unions, the city saw its factories closed down during the 1980s. The black community was specifically targeted with predatory lending practices that stripped families of their homes. Kamala Harris rose up the ranks of California's criminal justice system, riding a wave of mass incarceration. Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, and the bulk of the Democratic Party oversaw a huge increase in the rate of imprisonment, playing up the fears of the public with talk of super predators. Amy Klobuchar became a successful prosecutor in Minnesota using gang experts with no direct knowledge of cases to give testimony, frightening jurors and convincing them to convict black men. The Bush administration's response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was seen as horrendous confirmation of what the black community has been aware of for centuries. They are trying to exterminate us. In the aftermath of the natural disaster, the Superdome Arena was turned into a mini concentration camp, with thousands held there under the gun of the National Guard. The natural disaster was seized upon to degrow the urban African American community of New Orleans. Books like Michael Eric Dyson's Come Hell or High Water have gone into great details showing how the rich and powerful seized the moment for their agenda of impoverishment. During his 2008 campaign, Obama spoke of his enemies as a bulk of the U.S. population who reject the idea that their living standard is too high. You go into these small towns in Pennsylvania, and like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have been gone now for 25 years and nothing's replaced them. And they fell through the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, and each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And it's not surprising they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy to people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment, or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations. Hillary Clinton spoke of Trump's base as a basket of deplorables. a collection of irredeemable people who were a burden on U.S. society. On February 10th, 2021, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar called out the Washington Post on Twitter for suggesting that Trump's supporters were motivated by the economic hardships facing most of the country. Omar proclaimed, "It's not economic anxiety. It's anxiety over losing status and power that's fueling right-wing extremism. There is a white supremacy radicalism in our society, and we can't afford to dismiss or normalize it." The primary barrier to implementing degrowth in the United States is a layer of workers who have long enjoyed a decent living standard and are unwilling to accept the emerging low-wage police state. This silent majority that Nixon spoke of enjoyed a prosperous life since the end of the Second World War and are simply not willing to give it up in the name of saving capitalism. The idea now widely promoted by liberals is that working class people not wanting to see their living standards decline is racist. The white workers should be made poor in order to atone for the poverty that has persisted for generations among black workers, and of course, to save the environment from the scourge of human consumption. The conversation does not revolve around lifting the African American or Latino community up to the level of prosperity once enjoyed by the white middle class, but rather of impoverishing the white workers because they have an unfair privilege and sense of entitlement and deserve to poorer as a matter of implementing social justice. Among the liberals, the great danger facing the country is populism, i.e., the resistance to degrowth among the bulk of the population. The roots of this particular brand of Malthusian elitism are easy to trace. Leo Strauss, the philosophical academic who is considered the ideological father of neoconservatism, spent his career extolling these principles. Strauss's thesis in Persecution and the Art of Writing is that philosophers, the enlightened and intelligent ones, have always done their work under the threat of the inferior masses and had to write in code. Strauss taught his trusted inner circle of protégés that among the enlightened few, there is need to manipulate and control the masses. With no use for the white industrial middle class at the assembly line, and a need for more thorough exploitation amid an economic crisis, the aristocracy of labor that once held the imperialist homelands together is being terminated. The ruling class has decided to cancel middle America and to abolish the big soft middle for which the United States has long been so famous. While people of color, sexual minorities, and other groups can be viewed as victims on the basis of their identity, the multinational working class majority is seen as just one ugly mass of inferiority. It is an annoying herd the U.S. government is tasked with managing, and its living standards must be terminated. Living conditions for African Americans, Latinos, and other marginalized groups in the United States have been decreasing for quite some time. Mass incarceration, the inflow of narcotics, along with the equally damaging war on drugs, the closing of factories and urban centers, have all taken a devastating toll on communities of color. Amid all their grandstanding about Black Lives Matter and anti-racism, liberals do not seek to address these economic woes. Rather, the message is that the suffering that has long plagued the Black and Latino working class should now be more widely imposed and expanded on to the entire working class. Any complaint or outcry about it is racist. The richest of the rich are unleashing a fury of voices who preach hatred for America, straight white men, Christianity, and other targets deemed to represent the U.S. power structure. The message is burn it down and tear it down. Unlike the communist revolutionaries of the past, these leftists, who are promoted by CNN and MSNBC, do not seek to replace the U.S. capitalist system with the socialist one. Rather, they seek to transform the country into a smoking heap of ruin in the name of justice. Furthermore, unlike the communists and radicals of the past, who align themselves with those resisting U.S. imperialism, these forces are the most enthusiastic supporters of U.S. regime change operations and proxy wars, from Ukraine to Iran to Taiwan. Among this layer of woke activists, any talk of working to improve the conditions of the working class as a whole is deemed fascist and populist. The focus is instead pushing a narrative of resentment, collective guilt, and performative virtue signaling that can be used to justify driving down living standards. The 1619 Project of the New York Times claims the entire formation of the United States was to protect slavery from being abolished by a supposedly virtuous British Empire. Calls for implementing national health insurance or free college are now a crime called class reductionism, according to liberals. Jimmy Dore daring to call on the socialist members of Congress to actually fight for these things was deemed violence against women of color by a white man. The woke left hates the U.S. working class and its high living standards and sees them as part of an America that must be destroyed. While it highlights the oppression of various minority identity groups, it loathes any social democratic consciousness. The billionaires of the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller think tanks, Open Society Institute share their glee at seeing U.S. living standards driven down and are happy to foot the bill for this revolutionary activism. The foot soldiers of Nazi economics in the 21st century, who seek to save capitalism by forcibly implementing degrowth economics, are rallying under the banner of the woke left. The distortion of Marxism. The primary argument used to justify the need for a highly controlled capitalism to force policies of degrowth, i.e., fascist economics, is the environment. The idea that the planet has limited resources and cannot continue to sustain the population. Ha-Joon Chang, a Marxist economics professor at Cambridge University, has debunked this long-standing fallacy, writing, "I came across this book by a curiously named author, The Club of Rome. Flickering through the book, I became very depressed. It said we would run out of oil by 1992 or thereabouts. So, even before I turned 30, I thought, am I supposed to start riding around in bullock carts and burn wood for heating?" The predictions of the club turned out to be right. We have run out of oil. That is, oil that was accessible with the technology of the 1970s. But we are still burning oil in huge quantities because we have become much more efficient in locating and extracting oil from places that were just not accessible 40 years ago, especially the deep sea. Technology does not only give us access to formerly inaccessible resources, but it also expands the definition of what a resource is. Sea waves, formerly only a destructive source to be overcome, has become a major energy resource due to technological development. Coltan used to be a rare mineral of little value until the 1980s. Today, it is one of the most valuable minerals in the world. Tantalum, one of the component elements of coltan, is a key ingredient in making parts used for mobile phones and other electronic goods. At a less dramatic level, technology allows us to produce renewable resources with greater efficiency. One must ask, why are none of the voices that blame fossil fuel consumption for the climate crisis not enthusiastic about fusion energy? China's great breakthroughs point to a higher level of energy flux density that would render fossil fuels obsolete. If humanity was still burning charcoal for heat, the planet would have certainly deforested long ago. The nature of human beings is to constantly reinvent the way they interact with nature. If fossil fuels are proving to be unsustainable, why not take the obvious route of moving to a higher energy source? The degrowthers are not interested in fusion energy. The only solutions they can offer to ecological problems are reducing the population and reducing consumption. This points to the obvious reality that they have another agenda beyond ecological sustainability. The belief that the economy's problems are due to overpopulation, overconsumption, or endless growth is repackaging of the economic theories of Robert Thomas Malthus. Malthusian economics has long been debunked by Marxists, going back to Marx himself. Marx devoted many pages of his economic notebooks to refuting Malthusianism. In the collection of his writings published under the name Theories of Surplus Value, Marx wrote, Malthus's theories of value gives rise to the whole doctrine of the necessity for continually rising unproductive consumption, which this exponent of overpopulation, because of shortage of food, preaches so energetically. This theory, for its part, suits his purpose remarkably well. An apologia for the existing state of affairs in England, for landlordism, state and church, pensioners, tax gatherers, tenths, national debt, stock jobbers, beadles, parsons, and menial servants. Malthus also wishes to see the freest possible development of capitalist production. However, only insofar as the condition of this development is the poverty of its main basis, the working classes. But at the same time, he wants it to adapt itself to the consumption needs of the aristocracy and its branches in state and church, to serve as the material basis for the antiquated claims of the representatives of interests inherited from feudalism and the absolute monarchy. Malthus wants bourgeois production as long as it is not revolutionary, constitutes no historical factor of development, but merely creates a broader and more comfortable material basis for the old society. In his economic notebooks, Marx showed how Malthus' conceptions of unproductive consumers were completely false, but served the interests of the wealthy people who had commissioned his work. Marx wrote, Malthus's book On Population was a lampoon directed against the French Revolution and the contemporary ideas of reform in England, Godwin, etc. It was an apology for the poverty of the working classes. The theory was plagiarized from Townsend and others. His essay on rent was a piece of polemic writing in support of the landlords against industrial capital. Its theory was taken from Anderson. His Principles of Political Economy was a polemic work written in the interests of the capitalists against the workers and in the interests of the aristocracy, church, tax eaters, toadies, etc., against the capitalists. Its theory was taken from Adam Smith. Where he inserts his own inventions, it is pitiable. Marx's close collaborator, Friedrich Engels, blasted Malthus in even more fiery language, writing that his infamous population essay was the crudest, most barbarous theory that ever existed, a system of despair which struck down all those beautiful phrases about love thy neighbor and world citizenship. If one reads the Communist Manifesto, Marx makes clear what the purpose of the communist revolution is. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Marxism, contrary to other schools of anti-capitalism, focuses on the struggle for political power. Social democracy focuses on gradual reforms. Anarchism focuses on economic struggles and the forming of voluntary associations. Marxism seeks for the working class to seize control of the state and use the state to create a centrally planned economy, centralize all instruments of production in the hands of state, and with this centrally planned economy, raise the level of abundance in society, increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Marxist economic analysis focuses on the way capitalism holds back human productivity, creating poverty amid plenty, overproduction, the tendency of the falling rate of profits, etc. Marxism argues that by liberating the means of production from the irrationality of the profit motive, a new economy can be created that is so productive that abundance will escalate. As Engels explains in the Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, the expansive force of the means of production burst the bonds that the capitalist mode of production had imposed upon them. Their deliverance from these bonds is the one precondition for an unbroken, constantly accelerated development of the productive forces, and therefore for a practically unlimited increase of production itself. Nor is this all. The socialized appropriation of the means of production does away not only with the present artificial restrictions upon production, but also with the positive waste and devastation of productive forces and products that are at the present time the inevitable concomitants of production, and that reach their height in the crises. The ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world is based on this high level of abundance. As Marx explains in Critique of the Gotha Program, in a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Marxism has absolutely no interest in reducing consumption, imposing restraints on productive forces, or any form of degrowth. Those who led Marxist revolutions in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and elsewhere understood this and used centrally planned economies to raise living standards and industrialize their countries. It is only due to conscious manipulation of Marxism by some of the richest and most powerful forces that any notion of small is beautiful or less is more has been introduced to Marxian thought. Lyndon LaRouche, who emerged from within Marxist intellectual circles in the late 1960s as a harsh critic of the New Left, observed this fundamental change and distortion in his text, There Is No Limit to Growth. Marx's views were those of the Babbage variety of anti-Malthusians, and remained emphatically so throughout the remainder of his life and writings. It was for approximately a century and longer one of the leading arguments against capitalism by Marx and Marxists that capitalism braked technological progress, and that this breaking caused great harm to the world's population generally. The same viewpoint was strongly professed by V.I. Lenin. The CIA program known as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, that was launched in 1951, involved covert funding of Trotskyites, leftist academics, art galleries, and publications. The magazines Partisan Review, Encounter, Paris Review, and Der Monat became kingmakers in a new synthetically created intellectual circle called the New Left. Figures like Irving Kristol, Irving Howe, Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag, and Marty McCarthy became the well-funded voices of anti-capitalism and critique of U.S. foreign policy. They were funded primarily to counter any pro-Soviet or orthodox Marxist-Leninist voices, but their work also emphasized anti-populism. In their tirades against McCarthyism, they equated fascism and communism with all forms of totalitarian groupthink, in which the vulgar Untermenschen assemble to persecute their intellectual superiors. In addition to the anti-Sovietism and anti-populism that Rockefeller think tanks, the Ford Foundation, and the CIA introduced into left-wing discourse, Malthusianism drifted in as well. The critique of capitalism suddenly became a critique of consumerism. The talking point is part of Richard Nixon's famous kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev, where he belittled the Soviet Union for not being as wealthy as the United States and not being efficient in churning out consumer goods, was accepted at face value. With essays like Notes on Camp, Sontag and others began arguing that indeed capitalism was capable of producing endless wealth and unrestricted growth, but somehow this was dehumanizing. As right-wingers equated capitalism and the free market with having money and owning stuff, the synthetic left echoed them, agreeing with this definition, but saying growth is bad. The Club of Rome published their limits to growth text in 1972, 2 years after Democrats and Republicans united to make Lenin's birthday, April 22nd, a U.S. federal holiday focused on environmentalism, Earth Day. Amid an economic downturn, Jimmy Carter gave his famous malaise speech and told Americans that they should not be so concerned about their declining wages amid inflation because owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. Amid fuel shortages, Carter lectured the American people about why they should put on sweaters instead of turning up the heat. Ronald Reagan trounced Carter in the 1980 election. The hard-right anti-communist asked TV audiences, "Are you any better off than you were 4 years ago?" The memo was sent out that socialists and Marxists oppose wealth, and it is now routinely repeated by libertarians and right-wingers that socialism means making everyone equally poor. Meanwhile, all the well-funded voices of socialism echo this vulgar distortion. Michael Moore, with his film Planet of the Humans, Jackson Hickel's many screeds containing vulgar distortions of Marx's writings, the various bread tube voices pumped across social media as the appointed representatives of socialism and anti-fascism all repeat this mantra. What we have seen is a complete distortion of Marxism and assimilation of leftism into the fascist Malthusian schemes of the ultra-rich. In the direct aftermath of the 2016 election, this writer went to Wheeling, West Virginia to interview steelworkers who voted for Donald Trump. One of them explained, "The Democrats don't care about the working man anymore. They've turned into a bunch of socialists." Socialism, as the struggle for the seizure of the means of production by society so wealth can be created on a grander scale, poverty can be eliminated, and all can become prosperous, has been eliminated from U.S. discourse. Socialism is now a movement of middle-class intellectuals who view the working class of America as a vulgar mob of greedy, racist subhumans. Reinventing anti-racism. Rather than building industrial unions and unemployment councils, the socialists serve as foot soldiers for the ultra-rich and their fascist degrowth scheme. Not surprisingly, these socialists have nothing but hatred for China, Cuba, North Korea, the former Soviet Union, Venezuela, Vietnam, and other socialist governments around the world that hold on to the populist, pro-growth, historical materialism of Marx and Lenin. This new socialism should be called wokeism, or some other label because it has very little interest in economics, other than promoting a general contempt for average Americans and seeking to reduce consumption. The focus is on the fact that U.S. society is plagued by systemic racism, and millions of Americans have white privilege, which they must recognize and publicly atone for. The Communist Party USA was in the forefront of anti racist struggles in America, promoting an end to Jim Crow segregation and promoting civil rights for Black Americans long before Martin Luther King Jr., Paul Robeson, William L. Patterson, Henry Winston, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Claudia Jones were among the many Black intellectuals who praised the Soviet Union and cooperated with the Communist Party. The message was that the oppression of African Americans as a colonized people within U.S. borders hurt the entire working class. Black people were viewed not as a group of people subjected to special oppression, but as a nation within U.S. borders subjected to national oppression. The communists related to the struggle for Black self-determination, taking cues from how Marx related to the Irish question in 1870 while organizing among British workers. Marx wrote, "England, as the metropolis of capital, as the power that has hitherto ruled the world market, is for the present the most important country for the workers' revolution, and in addition, the only country where the material conditions for this revolution have developed to a certain state of maturity. Thus, to hasten the social revolution in England is the most important objective of the International Working Men's Association. The sole means of doing so is to make Ireland independent. It is therefore the task of the International to bring the conflict between England and Ireland to the forefront everywhere, and to side with Ireland publicly everywhere. The special task of the Central Council in London is to awaken the consciousness of the English working class that, for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation." The Communist Party was key in organizing the Civil Rights Congress and opposing Jim Crow segregation. The U.S. Department of Justice legally designated the Civil Rights Congress as a communist front in 1956. The Communist Party felt that the struggle to free Black workers from racist oppression would uplift all workers in the process, and would set the stage for the defeat of the ultra-monopolists that sat at the center of U.S. society. Just as communists supported the Vietnamese and Cubans in resisting U.S. imperialism, they supported the oppressed Black nation as well. Freeing Black people would hasten the liberation of all workers in the United States by uprooting the oppressive structures and relations that held U.S. society together. However, the oppression theory that dominates American academia has a very different interpretation. Rather than seeing Black people as victims of colonization and super exploitation as a colonized people, it says rather that white workers enjoy white privilege. The focus is not on liberating Black people from violations of their rights, but rather on shaming white workers for the supposed benefits they enjoy as a result of being white. Many leftist academics have made careers writing about how white people are settlers and enjoy lives of extravagance and privilege at the expense of Black and Chicano people. The millions of low-income white people in Appalachia, the U.S. South, the white people who live in trailer parks, serve in the U.S. military, and inhabit the U.S. prison apparatus, the white people living in homeless encampments near what were once prosperous suburban neighborhoods, are all written out of the woke narrative. White people are portrayed as wealthy, middle-class urban professionals. White culture is presented as the liberal values such people espouse and the comfortable lives such people live in relation to the nearby impoverished people of color. After the 9/11 attacks, Ward Churchill, the top Native American scholar in the United States, compared the victims of the attack to Adolf Eichmann. Churchill wrote, "As to those in the World Trade Center, well, really, let's get a grip here, shall we? True enough, they were civilians of a sort, but innocent? Give me a break. They formed a technocratic core at the very heart of America's global financial empire, the mighty engine of profit to which the military dimension of U.S. policy has always been enslaved, and they did so both willingly and knowingly. Recourse to ignorance, a derivative, after all, of the word ignore, counts as less than an excuse among this relatively well-educated elite. To the extent that any of them were unaware of the costs and consequences to others of what they were involved in, and in many cases excelling at, it was because of their absolute refusal to see. More likely, it was because they were too busy braying incessantly and self-importantly into their cell phones, arranging power lunches and stock transactions, each of which translated conveniently out of sight, mind, and smelling distance into the starved and rotting flesh of infants. If there was a better, more effective, or in fact any other way of visiting some penalty befitting their participation upon the little Eichmanns inhabiting the sterile sanctuary of the Twin Towers, I'd really be interested in hearing about it. In his essay, he argued that average Americans are complicit in the war crimes of the United States, lamenting that there was no widespread protest movement against the U.S. criminal sanctions on Iraq. As a whole, the American public greeted these revelations with yawns. There were, after all, far more pressing things than the unrelenting misery/death of a few 100,000 Iraqi tykes to be concerned with. Getting Jeremy and Ellington to their weekly soccer game, for instance, or seeing to it that little Tiffany and Ashley had just the right roll neck sweaters to go with their new cords. And to be sure, there was the yuppie holy war against ashtrays for our kids, no less, as an all-absorbing point of political focus. While Churchill comes across as a fiery critic of U.S. society, it is no secret that he has long been aligned with U.S. intelligence agencies. When Russell Means, the leader of the American Indian movement, began fundraising for the Contras of Nicaragua, Churchill functioned as his speechwriter, traveling with him to Nicaragua. Churchill even composed academic essays justifying collaboration with U.S. imperialism by indigenous people against communism. This hatred which Churchill spews at the American people echoes not only the other various CIA-linked leftist voices who have spewed anti-populism since the 1960s. It also echoes the agenda of the ultra-rich. Just as Iraq, Libya, and Syria have been degrown by U.S. foreign policy, the target is now the U.S. working class. The Midwestern Rust Belt was once made prosperous by labor unions built by communists. The Teamsters, the United Auto Workers, and the Steelworkers Union forced industrialists to sign union contracts in the late 1930s. In the 1950s, these unions had the leverage to demand high wages amid the post-war economic boom. In the name of saving capitalism, the ultra-rich now seek to impose a heavy-handed authoritarian state to force down living conditions and grind the American heartland into poverty. The aim, like the aim of the Nazis, is to save capitalism by reducing living conditions, creating an underclass of slave laborers, and setting the stage for war. The woke left that has fully departed from Marxism and embraces U.S. foreign policy are the primary foot soldiers of one Bonapartist faction that seek to carry out a kind of 21st century fascism. The current fascist threat comes from the synthetic left and its aim is to secure the power of one section of the U.S. ruling class so that fascist economic policies can be enacted. The proposed high-tech dark ages. The Biden-Harris administration stands with the four supermajor oil companies, the Silicon Valley tech giants, the World Bank, the Walton family of Walmart, Jeff Bezos, and the top monopolists of Western capitalism, in a drive to stabilize capitalism by imposing their own bonapartist model onto humanity. They face opposition from the fracking companies, the hotel and restaurant chains, the military-industrial complex, and almost all the lower levels of capital who see themselves being choked. The pandemic and the proposed Great Reset, apocalyptic warnings about climate change, all serve as justification for their plans. They accuse their opponents in the new right of being fascists and equate populism and anti-elitism with Nazism. Not all among the Bonapartist coalition to which the Biden-Harris administration are loyal have the same vision, but the high-tech dark ages they envision looks more or less like this. Number 1. Ultra-monopolies protected by the state. Cooperative capitalism. They envision a society where small businesses are crushed and the ultra-monopolies like Amazon and Walmart have complete hegemony, facilitated by the government. The employees of the ultra-monopolies will all be co-owners and receive stock option dividends based on market activity instead of set wages. This form of crude incentive pay will be presented as socialism and a worker cooperative, with the employees being powerless co-owners. The billionaire capitalist owners will still rake in super profits, and the workers will be pushed into greater and greater poverty. Much like Mussolini's corporate state, Franco's national syndicalism, or Hitler's national socialism, this highly controlled capitalism will be imposed by the state and utilized to stabilize capitalism with degrowth. 2. Cancel culture. A rigid code of social conformity and obedience will be enforced. Social media will be used to immediately track and highlight all dissidents and nonconformists. Those who speak against the ruling elite or violate the imposed restrictions on activity and thought will be immediately boycotted by society, losing their job, expelled from their schools, losing their access to the market, and perhaps even their housing. All their friends and associates will be pressured immediately to denounce them and cut them off or face a similar shunning. Rather than executing, imprisoning, or formally punishing dissidents, they will simply be canceled in what appears to be a public rebuke based on consensus, but is in fact engineered and directed from above. 3. Social engineering and weakening of the population. In this society, every effort will be made to addict people and make them dependent on the big monopolies and distracted from pursuing bigger questions or engaging politically. Drugs, both recreational and medicinal, will be everywhere. Pornography will be as well. The population will be dazzled by constant entertainment, over-sexualization, and intoxication, rendered unable to focus or think about bigger issues. An effort to make people weaker, physically and psychologically, will be carried out in order to make them easier to control. Anti-intellectualism will accompany a campaign demonizing physical fitness and exercise. Intelligence, physical fitness, or any form of strength will be labeled fascist, with those who display it being canceled. 4. Reducing the population, reducing consumption, atomizing humanity. Suicide will be encouraged and romanticized in popular media. Every effort will be made to cultivate the hopelessness, depression, and loneliness that leads people to take their own lives. Procreation will be discouraged. Families will be demonized as patriarchal, abusive, and oppressive. Religious organizations, fraternal groups, and all associations of people will be declared cults and widely demonized, if not forcibly broken apart. No ideology, church, or set of beliefs of any kind will be allowed to emerge and stand in the way of the mass programming of society carried out from above. Obedience to the social engineers will be described as freedom of mind and thinking for yourself, and all entities that would challenge their hegemony will be accused of brainwashing. Long-term relationships and even marriage will be discouraged. Every effort will be made to break each human being down into an atomized individual with no group identity or ideology and no way of understanding the world other than those deemed appropriate by the ruling elite. 5. Global war to preserve imperialism. A state of all-out, constant war against Russia, China, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries that have broken out of the Western financial system will be the new normal. People will constantly be mobilized and required to display their virtue by raising money, performatively making statements, and otherwise supporting regime change operations. While most of the population will be kept drugged up, addicted, and barely conscious, a layer of mercenary professional super soldiers will be cultivated to carry out this relentless bombardment of all headquarters of resistance around the planet. This bonapartist scheme by the richest of the rich and the tech overlords is intended to resolve the crisis of capitalism. The end game is reducing the population, reducing living standards, ending social unrest and opposition to austerity, crushing the global forces of resistance, and bringing the world back into balance. Like all the other Bonapartist schemes to stabilize a naturally unstable system, it will ultimately fail. The problems of production organized for profit will not be resolved. Humanity's inherent nature as a tool-making creature that strives to reach a higher plane will ultimately win out. The question is how greatly and how long this neo-fascistic social engineering nightmare will be allowed to unfold, and how effective the resistance to it both globally and domestically can be. Bonapartist struggles between rival factions and the ruling class have historically opened the door to socialist revolutions and overturning of capitalism. As is said, it is darkest before dawn. And while this nightmare labeled globalism by the new right hangs over us, the possibility of moving toward a society where human growth is no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market is also approaching. The coming period will be decisive as the contradiction of the prolonged capitalist crisis comes to a head. All right. I think that's a good place to stop for today. I am very close to what I plan to read, which is 2 hours and 10 minutes. And we will start next time to get our 2 hours of reading in with chapter 3, Counter Gangs and Revolutionaries. Counter Gangs and Revolutionaries. I'll have to double check how long this one is. I don't know if I can quite finish in 2 hours. It might be a little bit more than 2 hours. I'm going to save my progress here and shut this down because it does not like being left open the whole time. There we go. GarageBand is saved. We have the high quality version in the bag. All right. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing of where you can support me and support Caleb. That's all in the description. You guys know how to do this. Literally every single person on the internet asks you to do this. I'm just another person asking you to do this. But you can if you want to. You're in the rat race too. So, you know, if you're a little less in it than me, you can help us out. Anyway, I made it. We got the chapter done. Put it in the playlist, and we'll go from there. We're about halfway done with the book, and then I'm going to go back through, and I'll edit each page in a high-quality scan, and then go through in an editor and change each page as I read in that high-quality file. So you'll get a 4K version of this book with the highest quality digital audio I can provide. And that'll be the premier way to watch it. This is really what this is a way to force me to record it. I don't know. Some people cringe at the ENFP, Myers-Briggs, Jungian personality thing. That's what I am. Wherever I need a stage to work. I'm a, what do they call us? Verbally fluid people persons. And I realized with streaming, I can just work in front of people. And then you can get, I think it's cool to see like the behind the scenes of people doing things. So I was like, it might be a little rough here and there, but sometimes people like to see the rough edges of how the sausage is made, you know? My favorite part of that was doing my Barack Obama impersonation. So, all right. So check back for part 3. I won't say I'll do it tomorrow, but it will be very soon. Hi, XXX Tinchion. Can you say hello? Can you say hello? Can you say hello? At 9:07. So that was about an hour and a half ago. Hello. Sorry, brother. I was reading that book. That was the main reason I was here, but I appreciate you saying hello. All right. So, yeah. I hope you. What is today? Monday. I lose track of time in the summertime. It's Monday. So I love y'all. Have a great night, and I'll see you on part 3. All right. Peace.